Greetings. Thank you for coming on in. Just getting set here. I want to remind everybody that this is a Zoom webinar, so you're going to put questions in the Q&A. If you'd like to speak, you have to raise your hand. We may get to that, we may not. And the closed caption is right at the bottom. We're gonna start to get together here. All right. So welcome. And we will bring in David from the Heuristic Book Club. Oh, before you speak about the book club, I'm Allison from Source Booksellers here in Detroit, Michigan, and we're celebrating Ledger and Chain here tonight with the Heuristic Book Club, one of our favorite book clubs here in Detroit.
Well, thank you for those very interesting words, Ms. Turner. And yes, hello, welcome, and thank you everybody for coming out this evening. My name is David Bonner, B-O-N-N-E-R, and we started the Heuristic Book Club about 60 years ago. Dr. Lindsay Howard and myself, we were trying to put together a book club. Initially, it would have been the Heuristic Men's Book Club because it's not too often that we can assemble a coterie of Black men to come together and have meaningful, deep discussions on things with purpose and mission and function. And so we put together the thought of a book club, and we began meeting in the Detroit Public Library system. And of course, because it's Detroit Public Library and it's a government and federally edifice or building, of course, we could not, be the Heuristic Men's Book Club. But we are so pleased to have the great women that have really shaped and helped us to grow into the book club that we have been. And so we're 6 years in the making. We ordinarily read from January to November, and we pick our books and select our books on a voting basis. And then we select them based on that, the point system that we use to determine the order of the calendar year. And this year, The Ledger and the Chain by Dr. Joshua Rothman was our May pick. And so we will eagerly await to hear the words and the rationale and the story that Mr. Rothman so brilliantly sewn together to tell us about the one aspect of the American history that we seldom discuss and hear about, which was or is the actual individuals who dealt in the trading and selling of the slave traders. So I'm going to pivot and turn it over to Mr. Rothman, and he can enlighten us about the ledger and the chain. And I say be in for a really interesting session with Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for that introduction. Wait, did you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
May I introduce you?
Please, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Joshua Rothman is a professor of history and chair of history, the chair of the history department at the University of Alabama. He is the author of two prize-winning books, um, Flush Times and Fever Dreams, A Story of Capitalism and Slavery in the Age of Jackson, and Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia from 1787 to 1861. Today, he's going to talk to us about the respectable businessman in his book, The Ledger and the Chain, how the domestic slave traders shaped America. We celebrated this paperback in October, and we're reading it this month as a chief read for the Heuristic Book Club here in Detroit. And we're going to hear a little bit about the book from Dr. Rothman.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for reading the book. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's reactions and their thoughts and questions. And I want to leave as much time as possible for conversation, which I think works a lot better on Zoom than somebody just sort of being a talking head for a while. But so what I'll try to do is just give a very kind of brief overview of what the book is about and sort of why I think it matters. And then hopefully we can take the discussion from there. So The Ledger and the Chain, as you know, it traces the lives and the careers of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, who part of the argument of the book is that they were the most important domestic slave traders in American history. And by the domestic slave trade, what I'm talking about in the book is specifically the buying and selling of enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States. Right. So the domestic trade, it pre-exists the United States itself, but it really takes off in the 19th century. The nation is expanding into what was then known as the Southwest. White farmers are flocking to that part of the country to capitalize on Indian dispossession and the growth of the cotton economy. And as the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade took hold starting in 1808, farmers who move to that part of the country and they want enslaved laborers, they have no choice but to acquire them domestically. That is, if they want to do it legally. And slave traders feed this demand. They are essentially middlemen, moving people from one part of the country to the other. And nobody plays a bigger role in the slave trade industry than the men at the center of my book. Through their company, which was known popularly as Franklin and Armfield, they trafficked roughly 10,000 enslaved people from the Upper South, particularly from Maryland and Virginia, to the Lower South, and particularly to Louisiana and Mississippi. And they accomplished what they did very, very quickly, right? The company they created was founded in 1828. It effectively stopped dealing in enslaved people in 1836. And yet, in that short period of time, really in less than a decade, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard transformed the way the domestic slave trade worked. They turned it from something that white men might do in the short term for extra money. They turned it into a profession, into a big business, something that could yield tremendous wealth for its operators. And in doing that, what they really do is they not only make themselves very wealthy, they establish a business model for the slave trade that other slave traders would build on and follow for decades. Really, the model that they would follow until the slave trade ended during the Civil War. But what I try to argue in the book is that their impact isn't just about the slave trade business, right? That is sort of specifically their impact. But by selling the labor, the bodies, the asset values of enslaved people, what Franklin and Armfield and Ballard do, and men like them do, is they really make possible the expansion of the cotton and sugar economies. And the cotton economy in particular sat at the heart not just of Southern economic growth, but of American economic growth before the Civil War. And the capital that was extracted from the enslaved as they were bought and trafficked and sold and forced to labor, all of that capital then circulated throughout the entire country and ultimately across the Atlantic Ocean as well. And of course, slave traders and the slave trade ravages the families and the communities of the enslaved people who fell victim to it. And the numbers involved here are really they're sort of staggering. I think they're something that I think even people who are familiar with the domestic slave trade, and I've been surprised at how many people are actually not familiar with it at all. But even people who are often taken aback by the numbers involved. Between 1800 and 1860, roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly migrated across state lines. Probably about twice as many were bought and sold within individual states. So somebody who might be sold in one part of Virginia and moved to another part of Virginia. All told, an enslaved person was sold somewhere in the United States roughly every 3.5 minutes for decades, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for decades. And so what the book also does is it uses the stories of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard to try to trace the broader ebbs and flows of the domestic slave trade over time. The book tries to watch it grow and expand in the early 19th century. It sort of staggers under the blows of financial disruptions and then kind of rises again out of depression, only to become nearly as big as it had ever been by the outbreak of the Civil War, that, of course, finally brings it to an end. So the book covers a lot of the history of slavery, of the slave trade, of its relationship to the American economy. It does tell a story of several men in particular and their business that I think are central to that history. And it is a hard history to deal with. But I think among the hardest things, another thing that I think people find difficult to get their heads around is that what the book shows is that neither the slave trade nor slave traders really ever suffered very much for the criticism that they faced from the small number of American anti-slavery activists. On the contrary, they flourished. Slave traders flourished socially, they flourished economically. I think there's a lot of mythology to the contrary that suggests that slave traders were outcasts, that they were sort of the dregs of society. These were things that Americans said at the time, and they've said for more than 150 years since the Civil War ended. But those ideas are the idea that slave traders were outcasts, that this was sort of a disreputable business. It's largely a myth. And I think the fact that it is a myth, the fact that the slave trade was in reality a ubiquitous, profitable, sort of widely accepted element of American life before the Civil War, the fact that slave traders could be understood as respectable businessmen, people who were really important to American economic development, those realities say some pretty uncomfortable things about the history of the United States. But I do think that there are things that we need to learn how to face squarely, honestly, and learn how to grapple with. And I'm hoping that the book will contribute at least to that discussion. I don't think I would be foolish to think it could single-handedly change things, but I like to think that people who get a hold of it, read it, tell people about it, learn some things from it, can maybe advance our to the extent we have conversations about these things, advance them in a different direction. So I'll stop there. I hope that gives kind of a sense of where I'm coming from in the book, and I'm happy to answer questions for as long as y'all have them.
Well, Allison, do you mind if I introduce Dr. Lindsay? His hand is up. I'm sure you can see it, and I'm sure Dr. Lindsay, who was our resident historian, he taught 20 years at Chicago's DePaul in African American history, and he's one of the founding members of the Heuristic Book Club. So, Dr. Howard, are you able to get him?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. First of all, I want to say I taught African American history for 24 years, first at Highland Park Community College in Detroit, and then, of course, at DePaul University in Chicago. Um, I've been retired since 2014. I think had I read your book, had it come out earlier, I would have incorporated it into my lectures because the time that I was in school and training, I got my PhD from the University of Michigan. Um, your book has, I don't think I've ever read as much of a detailed account of the domestic slave trade as your book. Um, Most of the sources that I've been, associated with, and that was back in the Stone Age, they mentioned the domestic slave trade, but it was always kind of, at the last minute. It was kind of an addendum. Um, what you've done is to shed a light on a subject. One of the uh, numbers that I had to digest when you talked about there were probably 1 million slaves traded. Now, all the estimates that I've seen of the Atlantic slave trade, so there's about 300,000 Africans that were brought into the United States. We had one of the fewest Africans imported, but they imported men and women. So you're suggesting that 3 times as many slaves were moved in the domestic slave trade as were brought in the Atlantic slave trade. And to me, that deserves a lot more examination. That figure there, that was shocking because I had never seen any figures that even approached that in terms of the domestic slave trade. So this, I think, to me, is a major contribution to the whole history of slavery because this is an area that really has not been talked about. And I think your book is going to have a very significant impact. Again, if I was still teaching, this would have required me to alter my notes to some extent. The one question I
Thank
would
you,
like to
Dr.
ask,
Lancey.
yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
how did you get interested in this topic? Did you have an idea, or were you doing some other research and you came across these 3 individuals? What piqued your interest in
Yeah.
this?
So it's a great. So first of all, thank you. Yeah, I think your observation about the numbers is really sort of staggering when you put them together, right? Because the numbers of people imported to the part of the world that became the United States, right, is in the scheme of the transatlantic slave trade is relatively small, right?
Mhm.
Know the numbers in the transatlantic slave trade, it's anywhere from, roughly 12 million people. About 400,000 are imported to what became the United States over the course of, nearly 200 years. And yet in the course of about 60 years, so in a third of the time, about 2.5 times as many people are bought and sold within the United States, if not more. So yes, I think that the numbers there are something that people have trouble kind of getting their heads around. To your question, so the book I wrote before this one was about the expansion of the Cotton South. So specifically, sort of the growth of the most sort of cotton intensive regions in Mississippi, the growth of slavery in those places, the fears that white slaveholders had that slaves would rebel in those parts of the country. And of course, in the course of telling that story, of telling the expansion of cotton and of the United States, you have to talk how enslaved people got there in the first place. And of course, some slaveholders brought enslaved people with them, but the demand is so enormous that it couldn't happen without slave traders. And so, so the slave trade was kind of an element of my previous book. And when I started thinking about what I wanted to do for my next project, You know, I don't even remember how I came around to it one day, but I was thinking about the slave trade. I think in part because there's been a lot of literature in the last sort of 20 years or so about the domestic slave trade. If you look at the historiography, you know, there's a big book written in the 1930s. There's a pretty big book written in the 1980s. But it's really not until the late 90s that you start to see kind of a proliferation of work on the domestic slave trade. So part of it was that it was part of kind of a wave of literature about it. But you know, even in those books, what I sort of struck me one day that we were learning more and more about the slave trade, but we really had no idea sort of who are the people who actually do this job, who chooses to do this for a living, why, what kind of person does that, what are their lives like, what are their businesses, how do these operate, and there really just wasn't a lot to go on. There were sort of these little pocket biographies of people, you know, a couple hundred words here, a couple hundred words there. And the names that keep coming up, if you read anything about the domestic slave trade, the name of the company, Franklin and Armfield, is going to come up all the time. It's everywhere. And yet the men who ran that business, you know, there hadn't been a biography of Isaac Franklin since the 1930s. There hadn't been a biography of John Armfield since the 1940s. There was never a biography of Rice Ballard. And if these things were written in the 30s and 40s, you can imagine kind of what they were like, right? Sort of Isaac Franklin, this gentleman planter kind of stuff. And so that's really kind of how I got interested in it, and how I kind of dived into the project, was really just trying to figure out, you know, what is it that makes men like that tick? And truthfully, the irony is that even after I spent years working on this book, I'm still not sure I figured that out. I think I figured out a lot of things, but trying to get into the head of men who would choose to wake up every day and do this kind of work for a living, I don't know that I ever really got there. And maybe that's for the best, but that is sort of what motivated me in the first place.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. There's a question from Janet Jones. She's the founder of Source Booksellers. And her question is, thank you for identifying the domestic slave trade. It really puts the novel Let Us Descend by Jessamine Ward in an important light. Can you talk about the border states and the Deep South connection? How it is that some names repeat between Maryland and Georgia, such as Talbot County in Maryland and Talbot County in Georgia.
Sure. So I'm embarrassed to say that I have not yet read Let It Descend. I think I've read every other Jessamine Ward book, but I have not gotten around to that one yet. And I knew she was working on a novel about the slave trade, and it is on my list, but I have not yet read it. But the connection between the Upper South and the Lower South. So with specific regard to the slave trade, what happens, part of the reason that, you know, the dynamics that come together to create the slave trade really is, it's a kind of perfect storm. And it's a disaster for enslaved people, obviously, but the way the dynamics shape out, it's a lot of sort of puzzle pieces that oddly kind of fit into place, right? So you have happening at all the same time, right? You have things like the Louisiana Purchase that all of a sudden carve out this massive landscape in the Southwest for white Americans to expand into, you know, without sort of security threats from foreign countries. You have the emergence of technology like the cotton gin that makes processing cotton efficient and profitable. You have a massive demand for land and for enslaved laborers. So you have lots of white people who want to move to that part of the country to take advantage of what they see as basically a gold rush. The issue becomes, all right, well, where are they going to get all these people from? Now, the transatlantic slave trade is closed federally in 1808. That was, you know, it wasn't a guarantee, but when they ratified the Constitution, kind of everyone knew that 20 years after it was going to shut down. And So you have to get enslaved people domestically. Well, what's also happening is that the tobacco economy in the Upper South, in places like Maryland and Virginia, right, which had made those places wealthy from the 1600s, right? Maryland and Virginia become rich on tobacco starting in, the 1620s. During and after the American Revolution, though, you started to see a major disruption in demand from overseas, right? Because trade is disrupted to Europe. So that cuts off a major sort of customer base for tobacco planters. But the bigger issue is that tobacco ravages the soil that it grows in. It drains nitrogen from the soil. And so you could plant tobacco on the same property year after year after year, and the crop declines and declines in quality. So what you start to see planters and slaveholders in places like Maryland and Virginia do in the 1770s, 80s, 90s is they are turning their fields over from tobacco to grain crops, to things like wheat and corn, for which there's a huge demand in Europe because there are the Napoleonic Wars going on, right? Europeans are struggling to feed each other. So they're buying all of this grain from the United States. But the thing about grain is that it's not nearly as labor intensive as tobacco. So you have planters in the Upper South who all of a sudden find themselves with way more enslaved people than they know what to do with. They literally cannot use them as laborers. So some people make the choice to liberate enslaved people, right? There is a movement toward manumission coming out of the American Revolution. But far more of them, as the domestic slave trade picks up and as the demand in the Southwest is growing, what they can do with their extra people is they can sell them south. And so you have a migration that basically goes from the Northeast to the Southwest over time. And it's white people moving voluntarily, Black people moving involuntarily. And so the connections of families across space, the connections of names across space, basically, it's not an exact replication, but to oversimplify it a little bit, it's sort of a replication of the slave society in the East transplanted to the West. It takes different shapes for different reasons, but that's sort of broadly the dynamic that happens that makes that connection between the Upper and Lower South. And it's a connection that really stays in place until the Civil War.
Awesome. Dr. Smith has a question.
Hi, and welcome to Michigan, where it's
Thank you.
always sunny and warm.
This time of year, I bet is
No,
lovely because I can tell you that Alabama is quite warm.
no, it's fine. All my rhododendrons and my peonies they're all blooming, and they seem to like this climate. Hey, so I have a question about Fredericksburg, Virginia, which you talked quite a bit
Mhm.
about. Uh,
Yeah.
you may not know that around about 1844, between 150, 200, to 200 free people of color got up and just walked away from Fredericksburg, and they landed downtown Detroit. And what they brought their building skills, their merchant skills, their writing skills, and they brought all that stuff with them when they came to Detroit. Before they came here, many of them lived around the Planters Hotel, and and all the things that took place around the Planters Hotel there. Uh, and I just want to know, what was their experience in the slave culture of Fredericksburg at that time? And I mean, also, you mentioned the notorious slave auction block. That was removed with this past year. It sits in a museum now.
Yeah. I knew that I knew that that had been a site where they were trying to figure out what to do with that. I know it was sort of sitting on a street corner for decades. And I
It was
heard
sitting
that
right
they had,
right in front of the Planters Hotel, where they auctioned
right,
off
right,
slaves and rocking chairs and food at the
right,
same time. Yeah,
right. And it just sort of sat there. And I heard that they had moved it. So Fredericksburg, like a lot of kind of northeastern Virginia, is in this sort of weird in between, right? Because its economy, like I said, it's not only Black people who are leaving, white people are leaving those places, right? Because they're looking for new kinds of opportunities. And so, the economy of slavery in Fredericksburg and in Spotsylvania County more broadly, um, it had really boomed during and after the era of the American Revolution. you do, again, you have this sort of, it's pulling in two directions at once, right? You have a growing slave trade on the one hand, and you have people who are, you have a growing free Black population on the other hand, as people are getting manumitted. And so, you know, the culture of slavery in those places, it varies from place to place. It varies from person to person, but it's very, very different than the culture of slavery in the Deep South, which is part of the reason that enslaved people are so terrified of the slave trade, right? It's the biggest reasons are obviously that they are going to be pulled away from their families, they're going to be pulled away from their communities, probably never see those people again. I mean, families are just routinely destroyed. But part of it is that, you know, we joke about the climate, right? The difference between a place like Michigan and a place like Alabama. You can imagine, well, we can't imagine, but you can try to imagine what that was like in, say, 1840. The difference between a labor regime of growing wheat or corn, or perhaps working in a town, right, where you might not be in the fields at all, as opposed to being thrown into a cotton field. It's hideous. You know, it's really as close to, it's one of the most intense and awful labor regimes on the planet in that era. So, you know, if people had to be anywhere and they had to be enslaved, you know, if they could be with families and communities, they would have vastly preferred to be in the upper South than the lower South. But of course, if people could be free, that would be the ultimate preference, which is why people leave, right? Even people who were free in a place like Virginia, you know, being a free Black person in a slave society is a very sort of challenging and precarious position to be in. You had to rely on networks of connections to other Black people. You had to hope for, you know, patronage relationships with white people who you hoped would protect you, but you could never guarantee that. So, you know, I think, you know, if we read Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, which is a deeply problematic book in a lot of ways, but one of the things that Stowe talks about and exposes as a myth, right? Because the beginning of the book takes place in Kentucky, right? It's in the upper South. And there are a lot of people, white people in the United States who say, well, you know, upper South, it's so close to the North. How bad could slavery really be? And what Stowe points out is that the problem there with slavery, no matter where it is not how bad are you going to be treated materially. The issue is that your life is always precarious. It can be taken away from you in an instant for no reason, and you have no recourse for it. And that could be true for free Black people as well. I mean, we know kidnapping was fairly widespread, happened all the time, and people could simply be disappeared. So there are reasons why free Black people take the chance to leave when they can, even if sort of the culture of slavery could be sort of less hideous in some ways. I would never say that it's you know, it was not so bad. It's pretty awful no matter where you are if you are enslaved. But regardless of where you are, you always knew that your life could be forfeit.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Janet Jones says, you're right about the perfect storm, the puzzle pieces, and the unanticipated forces. The next question, this is RT, how did the traders enlist or entice medical personnel to keep enslaved persons healthy enough for sale to savvy buyers?
Money. I mean, that's sort of the short answer, right? I mean, you know, there are plenty of medical professionals in the South who fashion themselves as experts in the health of enslaved people. There was a widespread belief, of course, you know, given racism and people's beliefs in sort of the kind of so-called supposed natural differences between Europeans and Africans. There are doctors who believe that they understood how to treat Black people medically. But the short answer is that doctors worked for money. And if a planter said, you know, I have someone on my farm who is sick, you know, they get paid. I think the question is more, and this may be what the question is driving at, is how do you get medical professionals to see people who've been trafficked in the slave trade, right? Who maybe arrive in a place like Mississippi, clearly having been mistreated. Maybe there's cholera going around, there's an epidemic disease. How do you convince those doctors to say, you know, help me get these people cleaned up for sale, right? I think that may be sort of what the question is driving at. And you know, I think that maybe gets back to what I started with in talking about sort of the position of the slave trade in American life, right? I think maybe we'd like to think that medical professionals would find things like the slave trade simply too abhorrent to deal with. They'd say, look, man, I don't want any part of this, right? I help heal people, but this is too dirty a business for me. And I think the question becomes less of a question when we realize that, yes, it could be a dirty business. Everybody knew that. But it was nonetheless a business. It's a very established part of the way slave society worked, of the way the American economy worked. Enslaved people were bought and sold. That was simply a fact. And the conditions under which they were bought or sold could vary widely. And there are doctors who simply felt like, all right, well, somebody wants to hire me to make sure people are well enough to sell, and that's my job, and I'm going to do it. It would be nice to think that there were more people who said no.
Yes. Just the point of, I guess the point that Miss Anita Kent is here. She's a member of the Fred Hart Williams Genealogical Society, based at the Detroit Public Library. Just to let you know. David, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to engage Dr. Rothman. Dr. Rothman, I got a question for you. If you could elaborate, as you were writing the book, of course, there was a lot of information on Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, and so you took us through this journey of creating their firm, and of course, you know, they were the central figures, or as we might say. But you had mentioned like William Wells Brown slightly. You talked a little bit about Baker, who was I think Franklin's assistant, but we never got a chance to hear a little bit more of the human side of the actual slaves. For instance, Mary Swart, I think, the women and the violence that they endured, the rapes that came about, and we were the book club, some of the members, as we were talking about it, we were just really hungry to hear just a little bit more about those episodes. Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit more and sharing a little bit more that you may know about those incidents, and you know, the impact of those relationships between, you know, John Armfield, Rice Ballard, and then the slaves, and then, you know, the women that were in their lives, particularly slave women?
Yeah, so that thank you for the question, and thank you for sort of recognizing the difficulty of talking about it. It is honestly it was the part of the book that was it was the hardest to write, partially because the subject is inherently difficult, and partially because I felt more of an obligation than in most parts of the book to get it right. I know that writing about that subject, particularly as a white person, as a man writing about that subject, the the possibility of misstepping, of phrasing things wrong, of seeming like I don't kind of grasp the material effectively, like the possibilities for that were enormous. And I know that a book like this will never satisfy everybody. All I can say is that I did the best I could, and I thought about it very hard. To your question though about the voices, so some of the imbalance there has to do with sort of what the book was trying to do, right? And the book is trying to tell the story of slave traders, so they're always going to be kind of the central characters in the book. Um, Part of the imbalance has to do with sort of the nature of the archive, right? Enslaved people, white people by and large create the archive. And by the archive, I mean just sort of stuff that survived, right? Um, and it really was not their priority to record the voices of enslaved people. They didn't really care what enslaved people thought, what they said, how they felt. That's not what they were interested in preserving, right? They were interested in preserving business records, the thoughts of supposedly important white people, things like that. So what I try to do in the book, and of course, what's remarkable is how many enslaved people managed to make their voices heard anyway, right? And so what I tried to do in the book was whenever I could find the voice of an enslaved person that was sort of related to this story, I tried to get it in there, right? Which is why you do hear, William Wells Brown, right? I mean, he doesn't have a connection to Franklin and Armfield per se, but Walker, who was John Armfield's valet, basically his kind of personal assistant. We never hear Walker's voice. Like there's no, except for that one moment, right? There is that moment where they're traveling, and George Featherston, who is a British guy. He's a geologist, and he's sort of writing his kind of travel narrative. And he just happened to be in the stagecoach with John Armfield and with an enslaved man who I'm 99% sure is Walker, right? He's never identified by name, but it's clear that's who that is. And you hear his voice, right? And so I wanted to get that in there whenever I could. Because I think
can I jump
yeah,
in?
go ahead.
I'm glad you brought the George Featherstone in, because as I was reading that, I couldn't help but see the perfidy of his disdain for Armfield and his disdain for the slave trade.
Yeah.
And at the same token, when he was inconvenienced, he played his white privilege card.
Oh yeah.
And pretty much insisted on sitting in the carriage versus sitting or having his son sit on top. And I just found that to be somewhat, slightly humorous, but it really spoke to the hypocrisy of the times.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's also the fact that he's British, right? And so there's a kind of class element there. So it's for him, it's sort of both race and class, right? It's that I think the slave trade is gross. I don't come from a country where we do slavery, but I'm also a pretty wealthy white person, and you can't expect, that I'm going to sort of take second place to an enslaved person, right? So yeah, I mean, he could hold both of those things in his head at the same time, right? But I wanted to get to the specifics of your question, which is really about sort of enslaved women, right? Rape is a systemic part of American slavery. We all know this, and rape was a systemic part of the slave trade. It was no better, no worse. It was simply part of the way slavery operated. And what's shocking in the documents about the slave trade is not evidence that women were raped. That's not surprising at all. It would have been surprising if they were not. What's surprising is how casual slave traders are about it, how amusing they find it. It's really, it's the most disturbing kind of material in the book, I think. And it's very, very hard to recapture the kind of subjective experience of enslaved women. We do see it in slave narratives sometimes. I mean, Harriet Jacobs is probably the most famous example of this, who is really tormented by the man who enslaves her, who never actually does sexually assault her, but he keeps threatening to. And that is enough for her to, she hides in an attic for years rather than let him abuse her. But there is one point in the book where there is a voice from an enslaved woman who talks back. There's a letter in Rice Ballard's papers. The fact that he kept it is sort of remarkable in its own way, but it's a letter from the 1850s from a woman named Virginia Boyd. And Virginia Boyd had been enslaved by Rice Ballard's business partner. So after he gets out of the slave trade, he creates basically a company, a partnership with a lawyer from Mississippi. They buy a bunch of plantations and operate them. So they have like 6 or 7 different plantations they're running. Virginia Boyd was enslaved by Rice Ballard's business partner, a man named Sam Boyd. She is systematically raped by him for years. She bears 3 children to Sam Boyd. And then there comes a point in time where Boyd decides he's had enough of her. He's done with her. So he's going to sell her. And they all did this. Franklin did this. Isaac Franklin had a woman he raped and enslaved and had a child by. He sells her before she gets married. I was able to figure out her name, but I don't know what became of her, and I don't know, there's no record of her voice. But Virginia Boyd knew she was going to be sold. And basically, Sam Boyd gives her to Rice Ballard, and he says, look, I just want you to get rid of her. Mm-hmm. And Virginia Boyd, he does, and Ballard sells her. He sells her to a slave trader who brings her to Texas. And she manages, this is kind of one of the more amazing things. I don't know how she managed to get a letter out. She managed to get a letter from the slave pen in Houston to Rice Ballard. And in this letter, she tries everything she possibly can. She begs him to basically to bring her back to Mississippi, right? She's like, my kids are here. You're separating me from my children. She tries begging him. She apologizes. She's like, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but whatever it is, I'm sorry. She tries scolding him. She tries shaming him. She's like, I don't know how a father of children could possibly do this. She promises, she's like, look, if you bring me back, I won't say a word. I won't tell anyone. She tries every angle she possibly. She tries telling Ballard, she's like, look, I know you have kids. I know you're a family man. You understand. You get this. And so, there are these glimmers where we hear the voices of enslaved people, and particularly of enslaved women, and you get these little flickers of insight into what that experience must have been like, and how helpless somebody feels, and how desperate they feel, and how they're willing to do anything to change their circumstances. And what's so painful about it is that Ballard did nothing. He did nothing. He didn't care. This was done with. Like I said, I don't even know why he kept the letter. That's kind of remarkable to me in the first place. And that maybe there's something to that, right? Maybe you can read into that and say, well, he felt something, or why would he have kept it? But I don't know. I didn't get a lot of evidence that these were men who had much in the way of conscience, particularly when it came to enslaved people. But I think generally there's not a lot of sort of questioning their own morals and their own actions. But yeah, I mean, that's a very long way of saying I tried to get at these stories whenever I could, whenever the evidence allowed it. And I wish there had been more. And there are other scholars who try to do that in different ways, who are telling it more from that perspective. And I would definitely recommend that people go and check those books out if they're interested in more on that, of the perspective of enslaved people themselves.
Okay. Melissa Sampson says, hello, Dr. Rothman. Did you find any information that surprised you doing your research that made you reevaluate a particular topic for the book?
That's an interesting twist on the usual version of that question I get. I do get the question a lot that did anything surprise, like what surprised me the most? But things that surprised me that made me rethink topics in the book. I would say that there were things that I don't know about surprised me, but there were things that made me rethink how I wanted to tell the story. Um, when I first started this project, I thought it was just going to be a biography of Isaac Franklin. That was sort of my initial approach to it. And as I got into it, it very quickly became clear that there was no way to pull that thread, that you couldn't separate him from his business partners, right? It's not just their business lives were entwined, their lives were so entwined with each other. You couldn't tell one without the others. So that was one change that happened. The other change that happened is that I think the book evolved over time from being a story just about these particular slave traders, and I really started to see how their lives enabled telling a larger story of the slave trade over time, right? Because the book really starts kind of in the 1780s, and it doesn't end until about the 1870s. And so that, I wouldn't say it surprised me, but I didn't expect it when I started the book. And I think that most historians will tell you that a book project never ends the way that it starts. You go into it thinking it's going to be one thing, but you have to go where the evidence leads you, right? You have to sort of go to your sources and be like, all right, what is the story that I can tell here? And that story, your conclusions change, your ideas change, your preconceptions change, the narrative arc changes, everything is up for grabs and changes, which is why it's both terrifying to do. It's a real high wire act. But it's exciting, right? I mean, I often tell graduate students, writing a dissertation or a book or doing any work of history, it's sort of like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but it's a jigsaw puzzle that you have no idea what it's going to look like when it's done. You have no idea how many pieces there are, and you have no idea what the shape of the pieces are. It's your job to make all of those things. And so I think in terms of, things that made me think differently about the book, I guess that's what I would say was sort of unexpected. But that's not particular to my book. It's true of any book. I think the most surprising thing to me, though, and to the question more broadly, when I think about the slave trade, the thing that surprised me the most, it's not the violence, it's not the cruelty, it's not the mechanics of it. It's not that human beings can be this awful to each other. Like I kind of knew that. I kind of expected that. I think over time, what came to surprise me the most was that people survived. The ability of enslaved people who lost everything. They had everything taken from them. And they refused to give up, right? Simply surviving is a triumph. I cannot honestly say that were I in a situation like that I would have survived. And I think a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, you imagine yourself as, you're 20 years old, you're newly married, you have a baby, and all of a sudden somebody shows up at your door one day, they take you away, they plop you down 1,000 miles away, and they say, okay, work. If you don't work, we're going to beat you. And you're never going to see your family and your friends again. Would you survive? Some people didn't. Some people literally die of heartbreak. But most people survive because they had to, because they saw it as a means of resistance in some way. They rebuilt new lives for themselves, and they then passed that on to people in freedom. And it's miraculous. That to me consistently remains the most surprising thing. And I don't, there are a lot of things that came out of this book not understanding how people did, and that is certainly one of them.
Okay, we're at the last question. And from Janet Jones again, the conversation this evening makes me so proud of historians. We certainly need more contact with all of you in your deep research and your writing projects, which
Thank
is
you.
true from Sourcebooks Up. David?
Well, I would like to say that we truly enjoyed the book. I think that if, for those who have yet to read it, I would certainly suggest that you read it. It gives you, a different chapter, verse of, what took place during the American history that involved, the slave trade. And I think your research was pretty impeccable. The one thing that I sort of walked away, Dr. Rothman, was, I don't know if it was unintentional or intentional, but you certainly do Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard. You certainly showcased how they were able to basically cobble together a enterprise. And so we saw probably in good fashion, if we were looking at it through the lens of an economic conversation, we saw economies of scale, we saw corporate enterprise, we saw organizational skills, we saw what Michael Kors would probably define as the 4 challenges of market integration and market competition. And certainly we saw that firsthand. But before I sort of transitioned, I don't know if Allison had an opportunity. Anita Kent had an interesting question. I thought it was very interesting, where she's saying, based on your research and the writing of the book, the horrific slave trade domestically from state to state and how those forced slave traders profited, what do you think about reparations for African Americans? And I was, really wanting to ask you that question also.
That's a fair question. I do get that one sometimes.
I didn't see that one. Thank you.
So I wanna preface it by saying that I'm not a scholar of reparations, right? There are people who study reparations across cultures and across times and across situations and really have thought about it kind of systematically, right? Under what conditions does it happen? How would it work? And so on and so forth. So I don't pretend to be a scholar who thinks very hard and deeply about reparations. What I do tell people, because I think that when you have a discussion about reparations, it has a way of getting sidetracked very, very quickly. People, particularly people who are opposed to it, say, well, how would it work? What are we going to do? Are we just going to pay people money? Who's going to pay for that? I didn't enslave anyone. No one's alive who was ever enslaved. You know how this goes, right? And so when I talk about reparation in response to a question like this, I'm less interested in the details of that. What I do try to observe for people is that people in this country were enslaved under the flag of the United States for 75 years. They were enslaved under mostly under the British flag, but under the British flag, the Dutch flag, the Spanish flag, the French flag for 200 years before that. Generations of men, women, and children who were forced to work. They received no compensation for their labor. They were used as assets who could be bought and sold and loaned and mortgaged and underwrote banks and plantations and businesses. And then slavery ended one day, and they got nothing. They got nothing for hundreds of years of extracted labor. And all the money, and people ask me, like, where's the money? The money's everywhere. That's where the money is. If you want to know where the money from slavery is, it's all around us all the time. And I sort of just kind of pose the rhetorical question, right? If we, and I think most Americans think of themselves as believers in capitalism. Even if they're not believers in capitalism, they believe that it's only just and it's only fair that people be paid for their labor, that it is unjust to steal from people things that they deserve. And if we look back at the experience of slavery and emancipation, and we know that that debt was never paid, never paid. What do we do about that? Do we just decide, well, it's been too long, so we're just never going to pay it? Is that how America works? You tell me if you think that that's right, right? If you think that's right and that's fair, then we have nothing to talk about, right? It's not even worth engaging somebody in reparations in that discussion. If you can look at that set of historical circumstances and say, yeah, I think that's all right. I mean, I got nothing to say to you if you're that person. But if you're a person, we can get on the same sort of basic set of agreement that what happened was wrong, that this is a debt that should have been paid that was never paid. What do you think we should do about it? Right? I don't think there's a really strong case to be made against the idea of reparations. I don't see how you make a moral case against reparations. What it looks like, how it plays out, what are the mechanics of it? That I don't know. But I do know that there's a sort of fundamental question of morality and justice that needs to be taken seriously that I don't know that we've ever really taken seriously. And if we have, it's been a very long time.
Just to let you know, you might want to keep an ear out for what's taking place here, because Detroit, I'm not sure if this is a rare exploration, but we've commissioned, or we've developed a commission to explore reparations.
Yeah.
And that is taking place here in Detroit with we have committees, but
and there are states and localities that have done this, right? I mean, there are institutions in Virginia that I know have done it. I think the state of California has maybe tried to implement a program. So like there are things that have happened in places, right? But you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, you know, slavery was a federally sanctioned institution. And no, the people aren't the same, right? It's 150 years later, but the country's the same. The flag is the same. The government is the same. What do we do about that? I don't know. I don't pretend to know the answer. But I do think that the question is a very reasonable one to ask.
I hear you. Thank you so much. David, will you show your book?
Sure. So
this is my call to action. The Ledger and the Chain, available at Source Booksellers or any independent bookstore that you may it's kind of going in and out that may be close to you. Please make sure to pick up this book. It will definitely be worth your time, worth your read, and make you think a lot about this point in the past and how it affects the present. So thank you so much, Dr. Rothman.
Oh, thank you all. I really appreciate the conversation, and thank you for reading the book. And if you have other questions for me, I'm easy to find on email. I'm at the University of Alabama. Feel free to drop me a line, and enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks so much.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for putting that together. That was very rich, and I, really and truly enjoyed it. It's not often that we have an opportunity to engage with an author, particularly for someone who wrote so extensively on a topic. I was going to ask you if it was okay I know some of us on the Heuristic Book Club, we wanted to sort of hang out a little bit, or should we just move on to our a Zoom link, or could we use this, or what?
I think I can create a new one for you
Okay.
if you want.
And for those who would like to go to the after party, as they say, and
All right. Thank you,
pick this
everyone.
discussion up, you're more than welcome. I know that normally the Heuristic Book Club, we go to 8 o'clock. So Melissa, Dr. Lindsay, Rod, and whomever else is from the club, if you want to
Okay, I'll
jump
send
on,
you the link.
do that right now.